So this video talks about why good graphics don't matter. I've talked about this a couple of times, and I added it to my video of how to improve the gaming experience overall, where this focus on graphics is kind of destroying the industry. So I'm interested to see what this video has to say and better form my opinion and arguments as to why graphics shouldn't be the focus point in modern games.
There's always been an obsession with video game graphics ever since their inception, and as years have passed, graphical technology has improved as hardware has improved, naturally. And seeing the leaps in graphics since the early 2000s has been nothing but amazing to witness during my time as a gamer. But over the last decade, graphical improvements began to mean much less. Comparing games from 2023 to 2013, I often find that not just a few, but a lot of those games from before 2013 still look better than the ones releasing in current year. Now, certainly there are some noticeable improvements.
Yeah, like they're getting into the details, right? A little bit more, but ultimately, how much difference does it actually make? Like, what is the reward and diminishing returns on graphics? Does it actually make the game better? Probably not, but they put all this time and effort into it where it could have been spent elsewhere, right?
Improvements if you really focus on the textures and analyze the pixels when comparing a modern game to one a decade old, but playing a game like Dishonored from 2012 or Bioshock Infinite from 2013, or even The Order 1886 from 2014, if you didn't know any better, you'd think these games were new releases. They just don't look as dated as you might think for being 10 years old. Yet despite the technology getting better since then, very few games can top these games, or even match them visually. So why is this? Well, like all things, a tool is only as good as the one who wields it. And when in the right hands, modern game development tools can produce amazingly impressive results. But unfortunately, so many studios have been putting out games that, while graphically are impressive due to their technology that they're built with, end up looking like utter dog shit. A game like Forspoken has great graphics, but looks extremely generic and almost blinding in its visuals, in a very washed out and ugly sort of way. Immortals of...
It's an interesting point, because like graphically maybe they are slightly better, but I could see how you end up seeing a lot more of like rinse repeat mechanics within it, where there's less diversity in the game environment as the graphics look better. I mean, it's an interesting point, right? Like all of a sudden you start getting a lot of like AI generated or kind of like rinse and repeat characters and stuff like that, because you spend so much time on the graphics that you don't change it up as much. So you end up getting a more like generalized bland product.
Avium, a game released just a few days ago running on Unreal Engine 5, is graphically outstanding, but looks like an Unreal Engine asset flip project, even though I know it isn't. The devs probably did work very hard on creating those assets, but it just doesn't come across that way. And it doesn't help that this game in particular is so visually bloated. Like, I love fast-paced games, but I can't tell what the fuck is happening on screen here. The visibility is just awful due to the graphical and artistic style they went for. While I understand that realistic graphics sell to the casual audience, I'm always looking towards companies that have a more distinct...
That is a like good point. The art style makes a massive difference in the game. Immersion, graphics, and playability. Does the art style lend for the user to easily pick out certain things that are going on, and does the art style hide whether the graphics are over the top or underperforming?
Distinctive art style instead, even if it is more low poly. Some wrongfully ascribe this generic look of video games to the Unreal Engine itself, but just because a game is made in Unreal doesn't mean they have to look like this. I think Sea of Thieves is a great example of a game that takes advantage of the strengths that the Unreal Engine provides, and is a beautiful game in many regards.
Right, so like this is something that
separates it from a...
Like the art style in Sea of Thieves is absolutely amazing. They went with a more cartoony, but that gave you more bright and vibrant colors and gave you more contrast in a lot of the different areas, which allows it to shine, even though graphically it may not be as high tech as some of the newer games, Sea of Thieves does a great job at this. And I think a lot of games are looking for like ultra realism, but at the end of the day, a great art style will develop just as good as an ultra realistic art style or implementation of graphics, right? Like, I think that break from reality with some art styles makes it a better experience overall.
A game like, say, Atomic Heart. It's not the engine, it's how it's being used. Firewatch, a game made in the Unity engine, is another example of a game that's a visual treat, yet is not what I would consider AAA graphics. And to get to the main point here, I'm a strong believer that graphics don't really matter. To some degree, sure, but we've reached a point in the last 10 years, and especially in current year, where graphics have mostly plateaued. So art style is everything. And the fact that games from 10 to 15 years ago still hold up really well today is a testament to how true that statement is. Games like Rage from 2011 or Stalker from 2006 still hold up incredibly well. And games like Fable or Dragon Age and Kingdoms of Amalur employ a timeless art style and visual style so they can be enjoyed for years to come. 2 years ago with the release of Elden Ring, there was some very strange rage bait online about Elden Ring having bad graphics.
The graphics are dog shit.
Are you sure about that?
The graphics are
I don't
dog
think
shit.
so.
The graphics are dog shit. The graphics are dog shit.
But I'd take 100 different
Again,
games with
this
an art
is-
style half as good.
This is an argument where it's turned into graphics have to be ultra realistic to be good graphics, which I don't think is necessarily true. Accounting for art style makes a massive difference, and those art styles can allow you to have a lower graphical appearance game in a beautiful world that's still immersive and less demanding on your PC or consoles, which allows for smoother gameplay. So by dialing back the graphics, but coming up with an art style that enhances the look within the lower graphic settings, you get a better playable experience overall. Graphics may be an overused term right now, but like, these companies making these big games want to push higher and higher graphical rates without considering a lower graphical rendering with a better art style that matches that graphical setting to allow for a smoother running game with less load time and everything like that. And I think that is a focus that the industry should move to, is work on art styles that are immersive, that don't demand as much on the system as this ultra real to life settings, right? Only people that care about graphics are console plebes sitting there on their 8K. That's not true at all. That's so, that attack on console players is so out in left field, because PC Master Race Bubbas always talk about, I get better frames, I get better resolution. PC Master Race guys talk about how they're so superior because of their graphic capabilities nonstop. So that argument that only console players are the ones that care is outrageous.
Good as what FromSoft delivered before another Atomic Heart or Immortals of Avium or Forspoken. And I do want to reiterate something I've mentioned in my past videos, and that's that these two things aren't mutually exclusive. You don't have to pick just one. A game can have both amazing graphics and an amazing art style,
Correct.
and even high visibility. I think games like BioShock and Dishonored perfectly encapsulate that. But even games like Doom 2016 and Eternal are great looking games. And a trick I recently learned about Doom Eternal is that the lighting on the enemies are separate from the environment, so they are always lit and clearly visible, even in darker areas.
That's good.
This in turn makes the game look less cinematic or realistic, but is much better for the gameplay Doom serves. And even
Right, that is a mechanic that allows for better gameplay and immersion. I no longer get lost looking for what I'm trying to attack in the game, because they've added a mechanic that allows the enemy to stand out against the background, which makes it faster for me to transition from target to target.
The art style. The game director Hugo Martin said that during development for Eternal, they had at first made the lighting come from the environment much like they did with Doom 2016, but in playtesting it felt really bad because oftentimes you couldn't clearly see what it was that got you killed. And with Eternal being a much more punishing game and more fast-paced than 2016, visibility took precedent over realism. And I think what's really important to take away from that is visibility really matters in games. It isn't just Immortals that has this problem, it's a problem I and many others have with many different modern games. Now, I primarily play PC on a 27-inch monitor like 4 feet from my face, yet oftentimes there are so many cases where it's almost impossible to see an enemy that's right in front of me. Why does it feel like everyone just blends into everything? Now, some might throw out the realism argument here again, and games going for a more military sim style or something like that should lean into the fact that
maybe your first-person shooters,
and while
right?
I can understand that to a certain degree, seeing things in real life is much different than on a screen. Looking at a mountain range in real life versus a picture of that mountain range, your eyes can pick out much more things in person, whereas in a picture you're going to lose a lot of detail because you just have captured a 3D environment but on a 2D plane. And when you
losing that depth of field from reality to the game has to address that in a way that makes it even out, because I do agree with that. My time in Afghanistan in the military, getting into firefights, it's not always super easy to find the individuals you're trying to fight, but it is a lot different when you're looking for them in real life and you have that depth of field versus on a screen in front of you when things just kind of blend and disappear because you can't see the different layers behind it. I mean, games have to address that in the fact that maybe the targets need to stand out just a little bit to achieve that realistic view that you would have where something is moving that way.
You play video games, it's on a screen, which is essentially a picture. You aren't going to be able to see the same things on this
mountainside. It's a fair argument.
Battlefield 2042 compared to if you saw this mountain in person. I think back to the 2008 to 2012 era of FPS games, and the textures were a bit lower resolution, but the character models were often highly detailed, and it really made them stand out by having sharper objects on somewhat of a more blurry backdrop. This made it almost more akin to real life because your eyes can pick out an enemy a bit easier in those older games, especially at a distance. And funnily enough, you'll often see competitive FPS players cranking their graphics down in games in order to have a bit more of a competitive edge. And while I don't think every game should look like BattleBit, it's been a lot of fun playing that game and having long-ranged engagements in my gameplay. You can actually see enemies from afar, or see someone when they peek out from the side of a building. And it feels great to have some of that long-range gunplay in a Battlefield-style game again, like I did back in Bad Company 2.
Oh, Bad Company was such a good game.
I think one of the best examples of art style being more important than graphics, though, is with the PS5 Demon's Souls remake. I think in every way except for graphics, the remake is worse than the original. The atmosphere is much diminished, the art direction became more generic looking, and both the enemy designs and environments have been changed to go against the visual storytelling that the original did so successfully. And in turn, while Elden Ring doesn't have the graphical fidelity of the Demon's Souls remake, I think it's a far better looking game because of its incredibly strong art direction. Another example I've mentioned in the past is about the Destiny franchise, where there are many instances where Destiny 1 looks better than Destiny 2. The art direction and lighting of the sequel leaves the game feeling a bit more plastic than its predecessor. And while there is definitely some incredible visuals inside of Destiny 2 areas, it's when comparing places inside both games that you can really start to notice just how big of a drop-off there is in the sequel. Several shots on the Cosmodrome or the moon are noticeably uglier, and even in the reprised raids like King's Fall, great use of shadows and contrasting colors from the original are now washed out and missing detail in the sequel. Some of my favorite games visually are ones that use an almost cartoon aesthetic, like Overwatch, which has a very Pixar-esque look, or games like Kingdoms of Amalur, or the Fable games, or a game like...
Again, I think that bright, vibrant, a lot of times, that cartoony look can really make graphics stand out and pop. all of that can be manipulated. It can be. And like, I remember playing Destiny 1 and I didn't play a lot of Destiny 2, but I think the bigger point where the transition from you have this art style and direction with certain details and moving into newer updated graphics that are more geared towards realism can draw out some of that creative art style and kind of squash it or make it look more generic than it was before. I think that's not necessarily a dead argument in general, right? Because it is what it is in the other games, you know? But there is a chance if that footage from D1 and D2 wasn't doctored, then D2 does look a lot flatter and doesn't have the pop that D1 did. But it could have been doctored in some way. You're not wrong.
Alice Madness Returns. These games all hold up incredibly well today. Their visual designs have stood the test of time and can be played today without feeling too dated, due to the strength of the art direction and atmospheric design. Now, some games have bad art style and bad graphics. I think Pokemon Scarlet and Violet are a pretty good example of that.
Yeah.
Both graphically and artistically, they look like absolute shit. And that's not the Switch's fault.
It's not great.
Sword and Shield on the Switch looks much better than Scarlet and Violet. And for some reason, the more 3D and open world the games have gotten, the worse the visuals and art direction. It's both unfortunate and confusing because a game like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, a game also on the Switch, looks pretty good given the hardware. And I was hoping Pokemon's visuals would at least be somewhat
terrible,
in that ballpark
right?
by now. Especially
it
since
does
it's
look better than
possible.
Pokemon. That's realistic versus believable.
Every time I hear a studio try to sell their game and their focus is on how cinematic or photorealistic it is, I usually just check out. The industry spends so much time trying to make games realistic without remembering that games should focus more on the gameplay and its art direction.
Maybe I'm an anomaly, but I don't want my games to look so real that I can't discern it from reality, because I want my games to be a break from reality. I want a small reminder in the back of my head that I am in a world that's not the real world, right? It's so realistic that I would never get a break from reality, and I wouldn't like that. I want to know that I'm in a game world. And the photorealistic thing, I think we can push that aside for good art style and directions that increase immersion and enjoyment, as opposed to being picture perfect.
It's like they say, every time a game developer brags about how cinematic their game is, an angel loses its wings. I care much less about a world that looks ultra-realistic and more about a world that feels realistic, with a clear, cohesive art direction and world building through its environmental storytelling. And I think sometimes people confuse themselves into thinking a game that looks realistic is more immersive. But I think that has very little to do with making a game immersive.
I don't think the two are connected at all.
Do the visuals, sound design, music, and tone of the game mesh well? If so, then that's all that's needed to immerse someone. Going back to Atomic Heart for a second, I think a big reason why it failed to immerse me is despite its impressive visuals graphically, the game's tone and art direction feels very generic, and it pales in comparison to BioShock at every turn. And I make the comparison to BioShock because obviously it was a very clear inspiration, and is often compared to BioShock, but in Atomic Heart, the Unreal Engine technology is all that's selling that game, because the story, the gameplay, and the atmosphere feels pretty uninspired, which is unfortunate. It's a game that otherwise could have been really interesting, if helmed and directed by the right talent. Sometimes I look at games from 2014 and 2015 and think that visuals peaked back then. There's of course exceptions to that in recent years, but I think it's a bit wild that Assassin's Creed...
You also have this like point of diminishing returns where graphically, if you keep pushing the bounds, at some point the differences are going to be so minuscule to the overall user that they're not going to notice what's going on between the two. Like at some point you're going to push the systems to where you can't tell this minor uptick in either frame rate or, you know, how many pixels are being rendered or how fast they're being rendered. All of that starts to become less and less noticeable as you're competing with the natural eye and the lens of the eye and how fast that operates. So at some point, graphics, there will be no point to update or push them any further, because that's just as high as you're going to be able to tell the difference at. And especially for a majority of the people can't tell at lower rates than people who are hyper focused on like the graphic delivery of a game. There's some people, just like with taste and audio files and everything else, they can pick out differences easier than others. And the majority just has this kind of average baseline of, this is how I perceive what I'm taking in visually.
Creed Unity from 2014 somehow still has more striking visuals and lighting than the newer games. The Order 1886, despite being a fairly average game, looks absolutely amazing, much better than a lot of Unreal Engine titles in recent years. Dying Light 1 looks more impressive than its sequel. Even Far Cry 4 has more attention to detail than Far Cry 5, with 4 having much more lively environments versus the more static ones of 5.
I'd call them a draw,
Battlefield
if
1's
anything else.
destructibility and details beat out 2042, and it's not even close. Infamous Second Son, Arkham Knight. These games still outshine games 8 to 9 years later visually. The graphical technology and more high-res textures are doing a lot of the heavy lifting for modern AAA developers, because somehow we keep seeing regressions in so many different areas over the years. It's not just the visuals, but the animations too. But I'll save that for another day. Environmental storytelling is the most effective way to tell a story and immerse us in a world. Humans are visual creatures, and exposition dumping is often a big turnoff. This doesn't mean that dialogue or even some exposition is a bad thing, far from it, but it's important to make sure that the visuals speak for themselves, and the dialogue and exposition service the visuals, rather than the other way around. I think a game like Firewatch does this almost perfectly, and I plan to cover that in a future video, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss that one. Thank you guys for watching. Leave your thoughts on the discussion of art style versus graphics in the comments section, and I'll see you all in the next one.
Okay, so I think the biggest point here is that making the graphics and everything like that in a manner that aids to playability. So when he's talking about like targets pop out and you can tell things moving from their background and things like that, when you're making these like graphical art pieces and games, making sure that the mechanics and playability come first is and has always been kind of my big point when I'm talking about graphics. Graphics can be reduced to reduce the load and strain on the systems to make sure that you can tell your targets and move seamlessly through the world and game and not have issues there. Making sure that you reduce the load screens and transition times. Optimizing your game, focusing on the mechanics, playability, and immersion instead of the graphics and picture that people are looking at is where the industry should be headed. But game companies still talk about, these are the best graphics you've ever seen. You're never going to see something more photorealistic than this. And that doesn't service the industry as much as focusing on making the game a good game. You know, like, see, and that's the thing. Like, I don't have a 4K screen, and but I'm not running a 4K screen. I'm not even running like a high hertz screen. I don't care about the graphics. I care about how the game plays. I think that should be the focus, and that's way more engaging. So like, if you have an art style that looks good and is fun to play, that's going to carry you way further than photorealistic gaming. But that's the irony of it all, is a lot of people that complain about graphics aren't maximizing their graphics and using the top end gear to give him the highest settings available. That's accurate. I mean, not everyone's like that, but I think there are definitely people that are in that camp. I don't think you're wrong with that. It's an interesting place to be, right? Like, bro, better graphics already exist, and they do, and like, that shouldn't be the focus, honestly. It really shouldn't be, and I think it's a disservice to focus on stuff like that, because there are other things you can do to make the game more enjoyable than graphics. Graphics alone will not give you a best-selling game. Graphics alone are not the key to all your woes in life. It is just a band-aid to hide the underlying mechanics of the game. And if the mechanics are good, the story is good, it's immersive, and the world is engaging, that'll take you way further than any graphic ever would. And that's why the goal should not be to be the best graphics. The goal should be to have the most immersive world possible that runs smoothly and has fun mechanics.
And subscribe, do this stuff. You want all that? All of that. Hey there, it's Skeg Broggy. Thanks for watching the video. And if you enjoyed it, please let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button and follow me here on Twitch for more awesome content. Link is in the description.